The sort of unifying feature of consciousness, in a sense, is that there is an inherent reflexivity. We know that we know. In our architecture, our computational architecture, what we have is that the reality model, the generative phenomenal world model, unified world model, feeds back onto itself. So it actually knows itself. So it's like the brain has an eye on itself.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. This week on the podcast, previous guest Shamil Chandaria is returning to discuss his recent paper, A Beautiful Loop, an active inference theory of consciousness, co-authored with Ruben Laukkonen. Shamil is an expert in artificial intelligence and computational neuroscience. He was a founder of the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, where he's a research fellow, and he's also a research fellow at the School of Advanced Studies Institute of Philosophy, which is part of the University of London. He's a senior research fellow at the Centre for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing at Oxford University, and most recently he became a fellow of Fitzwilliam College at Cambridge University. Shamil's work is really at the cutting edge of the intersection between science and spirituality, so I hope you enjoy hearing this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. So yeah, the excuse for us to do a recorded chat today is this Beautiful Loop paper that you just published as a preprint, right, with Ruben Laukkonen. And yeah, I guess I want to give you the chance to kind of take the audience through it, because it's a beautiful paper about a beautiful loop, lots of beauty going on. Yeah, I think unless you wanted to give a kind of general, maybe I was going to ask you to kind of begin, because it's like an active inference theory, right, of consciousness. So I was going to prompt you to start with active inference, but maybe if there's any kind of preliminaries you want to say about what this whole thing's about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are two possible places we could start. One is from active inference, and the other is actually from consciousness science. I mean, maybe I'll do a bit of a general overview of where consciousness science is first, and then we'll dive into kind of the predictive processing active inference theory that we're proposing.
That sounds great.
Just to contextualize the second part in the wider view of where the neuroscience of consciousness has got to. So obviously, as you've discussed on your channel a lot, consciousness and the metaphysics of consciousness has been a deep issue for 3,000 years. And I think, starting around 30 years ago, there was this push in neuroscience to say, okay, well, look, there are all these difficult questions that philosophers have been grappling with, but can we start looking at the brain and get an idea of what's going on when we consciously process information? What is it what's special about certain information processing that makes it conscious? And the initial idea was to look for the neural correlates of consciousness. And this was, famously, Crick and Christoph Koch started this back in the 90s or earlier, I think. And that project actually has been continuing, but during that period, there's been also a whole load of theories which are based in the brain or even based in computational models. And I'll come on to the difference, because what we're proposing is a computational model. And the leading few are the global workspace theory, integrated information theory, higher order thought theory, local recurrence theory. And then there's a sort of a fifth one that everyone thinks should be there, but hasn't really been fully worked out. There are some proposals, and that's predictive processing theory of consciousness or active inference theory of consciousness. And everyone thinks that one is very important because, in a sense, active inference and predictive processing, as we talked last time, is probably the closest thing that some people think we have to a general theory of how the brain works. So it's a
Right.
really good model of cognition, but yet we haven't tied it into consciousness yet. Okay. So let's just quickly review what the other theories are, because I think one of the powerful things about our approach is that, we'll come back to this at the end maybe, is that there are amazing bridges to all of these other theories of
Right.
consciousness. And that's important, just to say, because all of these leading theories of consciousness, global workspace theory, local recurrence theory, even integrated information theory and higher order thought theory, have actually all claim to have lots of evidence in favor of them. And some of the evidence is pretty good. It's pretty interesting. When you look at what's happening, when you look at how things come forward in the brain and then get broadcast around, and you see a spike at 300 milliseconds, this is kind of saying, oh, there's really some evidence for example, a global workspace theory. So this is strange why all of these other theories seem to have evidence. And could it be that they're all parts of a more general theory? They're all angles of looking at this wider whole. And in a way, what we're doing is providing another angle and then seeing that they all connect together.
Yeah, I think we both share a wider, I guess, kind of philosophical perspective on a kind of meta perspective on this stuff, where the kind of elephant in the blind man parable, right? Where rather than being entrenched in one camp and being like it has to be this way of looking, we kind of embrace ways of looking at, like, the ground can be so rich that these different theories can have a lot to offer without being the whole picture. And yeah, the great thing that your paper's doing is trying to synthesize, right, and explain within the predictive processing active inference framework why how all these things have truth to them and how they can all be synthesized.
Yeah, exactly. So very quickly, just a few sentences on what these other theories are before we go into ours.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, I think one of the most powerful is the global workspace theory, and that is that we have a whole load of separate modules that are processing visual information and auditory information and various other things, often in the back of the brain, and then they they compete to be written up on a global blackboard, if you like, in the front of the classroom. And so someone says, look, I've got some really important information. Everyone needs to know this. And they fight it out. And the parts of information processing that win that fight get written up on this global blackboard and then rebroadcast back throughout the brain into all these other, so they're used for action, they're used for further processing, they're rebroadcast back to the other modules so everyone can share this information. Daniel Dennard had a very evocative phrase back in the 90s that he said, consciousness is like fame in the brain. You get into the newspapers and everyone knows what's going on. So that's very a powerful theory. And of course, as I said, there's all of these theories that I'm talking about actually have bags of evidence in favor of them. The second approach was actually going back to deep neuroscience data in the back of the brain, saying, look, really, there are these local recurrence loops where higher areas in the hierarchy of processing feed back onto lower areas. For example, visual area V1 is right at the bottom of the hierarchy, and then V2, and then MT, and all of this stuff. Well, higher order areas will receive information from the lower areas and then feed back context information, saying, okay, you see this, and this is the foreground and this is the background, or there are edges here that we need to, or that this is a rewarding stimulus. This is an apple, for example, and that you can eat it, or that this phone is moving and I can't quite figure out where it is, but I think it'll be at that end of the screen because it's had a trajectory, and that's where I forecast it to be. That's where I predict it to be. So higher order systems can feed back to lower systems and say, actually, in the overall model of what's going on, this is where you should really expect it. So let's fill in the details and paint in the picture a little bit more. And that goes on throughout. And it's that local recurrence or reentrant loops that go on in the back of the brain that are considered to be the seat of consciousness, so to speak. Another theory is integrated information theory. And this is not based in the actual, and it doesn't start off in the anatomy of the brain. It actually starts off looking at the brain computationally, algorithmically, and says that, look, there's information sharing, there's information processing going on throughout the brain. But this information processing end up being very networked and feedback on itself. And so what ends up happening is that certain whole networks effectively have integrated information. That is, that one part of the network has information about what's going on in another part of the network. And in a sense, the whole has the most information about the whole. So this is a very powerful idea, and we can make this this basic idea that there is this whole that has more information than the subparts, and the information turns out to be causal information. In fact, we can make it precise using information theory, and that's what integrated information theory does. Now, of course, to some extent, there's a lot of criticism because it's a very precise framework, and people say, "Oh, well, that can't be right." But on the other hand, there seems to be some sort of truth that it seems to be capturing. There's something about, well, in a sense, it's another version of fame in the brain. It's just that it's delocalized fame in the brain. So this is interesting. And then there's another theory, which is like higher order thought theory, where we have representations at the back of the brain, but they only become conscious when they're re-represented, kind of like a meta-awareness in the front of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, for example. And so, I may be aware of a phone, but I only know that I'm aware of it when I'm actually got a re-representation of it. And not everything, again, gets to be re-represented. So those are the basic theories. Now, Ruben and I have been thinking about this stuff for the last decade in a way. We're both been very taken with the power of the free energy principle and active inference and predictive processing as you are. And exactly as you have surmised, we think that, well, look, this seems to describe what the brain is doing algorithmically, where it's doing approximate Bayesian inference. It's doing Bayesian inference in a hierarchical generative model. And that would be like, surely we should understand consciousness from that perspective. And so the first approach, and now I'll sort of move into our theory. The first approach with this is to say, well, look, as we discussed last time when we talked, the way that the brain has to make sense of all this sensory data that it gets is by saying, well, the brain's trying to figure out what are the causes of its sensory data. And it can't do that directly. That inverse inference problem is just too difficult computationally. So what the brain does and what machine learning and artificial intelligence does is it has this workaround, which is to say, okay, let's make our best guess of what's going on and then have a generative model and simulate what we think is going on, have a model of the world, have a generative model, which then the output of that generative model is what we would see. Okay, I'll come back to that because that's talking about consciousness. But what we then do is to say, well, let's compare the output of that generative model to the sensory data that we get, and then minimize the prediction error, change the generative model, change the simulation a little bit so that it minimizes the prediction error with the sensory data. So we're kind of tuned into the world. We're not just hallucinating, it's controlled hallucination. We're sensitive to the data that we receive. Okay, so I already hinted there that this generative model could be a phenomenal generative model. That means an experienced model. That's what we actually experience. What we actually experience is not the world out there. We're not seeing through our eyes. We're actually experiencing our internal simulation. If you like, we're living within our own internal simulation. Now, the issue there, and I've talked like this, and we talked like this last time, but the issue there, and I always used to, parenthetically say, look, just as a footnote, not everything makes it into the generative model. And this is the issue, that if predictive processing and active inference is a general theory of what's going on in the brain, then surely I should be aware, and if that's what my awareness is, I should be aware of everything, including all this unconscious processing that's presumably also using predictive processing. So how come consciousness, actually in reality, we're only conscious of a very small part of our information processing? A very classic example of this is binocular rivalry. So what you do there is you feed one eye a picture of a house, for example, and you feed the other eye a picture of a flower. Now, the house and the flower, this is a confusing message to the brain. And rather than try to put it together and see a flowery house or something, what the brain does is you see a house, for example, for a few seconds, and then it flips to seeing a flower, and then it flips to seeing a house. And so we know that, but when we do the brain scanning, we can see that both images are kind of starting to develop at the back of the brain, yet only either the house or the flower gets through to consciousness. So the idea is that there is a kind of inferential competition, in everything that we see. So there's lots of things going on in the unconscious, lots of multiple drafts, to use again, I think Daniel Dennard's views, that are going on. And there is like global workspace theories, there's a kind of a competition amongst these ideas to say, who gets into the generative phenomenal world model? Okay, so this generative phenomenal world model is what we're conscious of, but not everything gets into it. For example, sometimes a flower doesn't get into it, sometimes a house gets into it, and vice versa. And this inferential competition, actually, it works if the inferences are very good. Now, what makes an inference good? What makes an inference good is if it coheres with our priors, but also not just the priors around that this is a flower, but also priors about the general context of what's going on. So if I'm in a park and there's something strange there, and it could be an alien spacecraft, or it could be, a swing set, a playground. I'm going to perceive it as a playground because that actually coheres with the rest of the world model. So this is a kind of a global context signal. In other words, there's, and we call this Bayesian binding. So there's Bayesian binding at a very local level, how priors and likelihoods, how the data and our expectations around the data, this is a face, come together. But then there's these Bayesian binding that happens at a global context, where in the same way as we have local Bayesian binding, we have this global Bayesian binding, which is what story really coherently coheres together.
So there's so much good stuff there. I think it'd be good to zoom in on you brought up priors, and I think we should remind people of exactly what we mean by this terminology. And so I'll go over a bit of the terrain so that we can get a feel for it. So you mentioned that we have this generative model of the world and what's going on there, and within that we have, well, that's constituted by prior expectations of what kind of data what kinds of things we're likely to see. So a human has a strong prior of seeing a face at some point in their day, probably, right? If you went a month and you didn't see a human face, your system would probably think, okay, something's wrong here. So compared to, say, a polar bear, if you go a month without seeing a polar bear, you have less of a prior expectation of seeing that. And then you have, based on those priors, you have a kind of the likelihood as well. Like how likely is the data, what data am I expecting to see based on those priors? So if I have the expectation that there are humans around, it's likely I'm going to hear human voices. That wouldn't create much of an error signal. But again, the sound of a polar bear would be surprising. So with this, we're kind of generating the output of this generative model. We have this simulated world, this controlled hallucination that's being tuned by the kind of constantly inflowing data we're getting, and we're constantly adjusting to not be surprised, to not have prediction errors. Because if you're out of touch with reality, you're not going to survive very long. So there's this kind of Darwinian selection imperative to stay fine-tuned to what's going on. So that's the kind of basic picture of perception under this kind of predictive processing, free energy principle framework. And then, and we're both pointing to this idea that the output of the generative model is your experience, right? That what we call the posterior, I guess, would correspond to it in terms of you're synthesizing your prior expectations with the incoming information. And so you've got this.
And I just need to add parenthetically that some of the output of your generative model, because it has to go through a competition. Yeah.
So I mean, someone might imagine you've got your kind of the generative model in terms of maybe like the synapses in the brain, it's speculative, but you could be over time storing things like, I expect to see a face at some point. But if you're just looking at a blank white wall, you might not see a face. But if you're looking at some clouds, then it might be leveraged so that maybe the neural activity in, face areas of the brain become active, and then you might be getting into the kind of territory where you're actually going to perceive a face. So that's the picture. But then you are moving forward from that to say you've then got this kind of bigger question of, okay, well, now we're talking about maybe a single percept seeing a face, but actually we're perceiving this whole rich scene, and you have things like the binding problem where, people will, if you're watching a video, will be perceiving the visual input of my face and my mouth moving, but also the sound of my voice. And you're not hearing those as two disparate things. You're perceiving this coherent, bound percept of a human being, right? And a human being in a scene, in a room. And so you've got this whole kind of hierarchical stack of priors that are being leveraged in line with the incoming data to simulate this whole complex world at multiple scales.
Right. Exactly. And as you describe, this binding problem has really been a real issue in consciousness science, which is how does the sound and of clapping and actually the action, the visual stream kind of come together in this unified percept of a clap. And what we offer is here a kind of a solution based in the mathematics of Bayesian inference, which is that things actually bind together exactly like the prior and the likelihood bind together to form a unified posterior. This is happening at a global scale where priors and posteriors cohere. It's just that they have to cohere with the unified whole of the entire generative phenomenal unified world model. So that's a big mouthful. Generative, means it's the output of multiple generative models. Generative phenomenal, that means this is what we actually experience. World model, so the word unified is very important there, that it's unified, that it is bound together, that it's a world model. That's our entire simulation. And this generative phenomenal world model, we actually end up calling our reality model. Because actually, that's what we naively think. It's the whole of what we experience. It's our reality. So that's two of the major conditions that we have for consciousness. A reality model that's bound together in this way, and an inferential competition to get in there. And then the final and kind of almost most important part of the theory is something that we call epistemic depth. And so eventually we call this theory the epistemic depth theory. And that is that there's one very, very important thing in consciousness, which all the other theories of consciousness also hint at, which is that there is an inherent reflexivity in whichever of these models that in a way, people haven't really tuned into this enough, but the sort of unifying feature of consciousness, in a sense, is that there is an inherent reflexivity. We know that we know. And so what in our architecture, on our computational architecture, what we have is that the reality model, the generative phenomenal world model, unified world model, feeds back onto itself. So it actually knows itself. So this is important because this is actually the critical thing. So let me give a couple of intuition pumps here. So it's like the output of the brain it's almost like the brain has an eye on itself. It's like the reality model feeds back onto the reality model as if it was another sensory channel. But actually, this happens automatically within the hierarchical generative model. So another way of putting it is imagine, when we talk, we're talking, and actually we're also hearing ourselves at the same time. So we know what we've just said. And if this happens to our reality model as a whole, the reality model knows what it knows. And we think that's first of all, the real signature of consciousness. But actually, as an aside, it's actually tremendously helpful for general intelligence. And when we go on to artificial intelligence, you'll see that actually this is one of the sort of ideas that maybe AIs, when they get really generalized intelligence, will have to have this kind of feedback loop onto itself. And so that's the beautiful loop part, in a sense, that the reality model knows itself. And this is important. Although the model feeds back on itself, what we call technically reflexivity precision, so the weighting of the sensory channel back to of the reality model back onto itself, it's sort of weighted input. Now we can dial up the precision, this is a technical term in predictive processing, but dial up the precision weight, the weighting of that reality model back to itself. So when you really dial it up, and this is what, for example, advanced meditators can do, really be aware that they're aware, then what happens is that the reality model really recognizes that I know that I know that I know this.
So that's a great thing to unpack for people, because so if you have a kind of, if you look straight ahead with both your hands up and don't look at either of them, just have a kind of dilated awareness, you can do this phenomenon called covert attention, where you shift your attention to, say, the right hand without moving your eyes, and so there's some kind of mental action happening there. And the way we think about this in this framework is you're increasing the precision. You're weighting you're kind of, I think the idea of grip can be useful. It's like the system is gripping onto that sensory input coming from the hand, and so it's kind of amplifying and zooming in on it. And that's how we think attention works. And we can come back to that, because you talk about that in the paper really nicely. And so you've got the model feeding back on itself, and I love that the line in the paper about it being like a sensory input to itself. And so it's knowing that it knows, and then it's gripping onto that. It's like zooming in and you could say resonating, maybe, to be more poetic about it, but like it's kind of, getting to this amplified feedback loop, and really, gripping onto the fact that it knows that it knows. And then in states of meditation, you can just have increased luminosity, right? You write about in the paper, the term that's used in kind of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, this quality of consciousness. And actually, a bit I really liked in the paper was that, because my first thought when reading that is you talk about how within that luminosity you can kind of see the non-dual nature of awareness, that everything's arising within awareness, whether we think of it as inside or outside typically. But my initial thought was, well, when you have that knowing that that increased luminosity, for me it feels like the insight there is that awareness it's always been the case that awareness has been present. And so it's not that something is kind of genuinely being added, but it's more, it's been revealed. And you say in the paper that this is kind of like a revelation, and I really like the use of that word, that the knowingness of awareness reveals that awareness was always there all along, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I really like the way you put it, in terms of this reflexivity, precision weighting, is amplification. In other words, we're amplifying that channel back to the reality model of the reality model. And as you as you correctly anticipated, this is very linked to the story of attention. So attention is, in a way, an amplification or an upweighting of certain contents, the ones that are attended to, in your reality model. And so if I pay attention to my hand, what I'm doing is I'm upweighting the hand in my entire reality model. I'm increasing its presence in the conscious gestalt. So 80% of my bandwidth is occupied by the hand, right? Now, precision weights sort of generally add up to 100%. So if 80% is occupied by my hand, then the rest of the reality model is kind of down weighted. It's like a kind of like a magnifying glass in a way, rather than a spotlight, which attention is often thought of it as a spotlight. It's better to think of it as a kind of a magnifying glass, as you say, an amplification device.
Yeah. I think a great thing about you and Ruben working together is you've both very thoroughly seen through the illusion of being a contracted self that lives in the head, and see that because, and you say in the paper that we shouldn't be thinking of that kind of selfhood as a prerequisite for consciousness, but rather consciousness arises first, and then that experience of the self arises within it. And so when you have that understanding, you see that our folk intuition notion that when I pay attention to my hand, what's happening is I'm in my head sending some kind of spotlight of awareness onto the hand, that's actually a construct. That's not what's happening. And there's a great where you write about how, so in meditation, when someone says pay attention to your breath, it's not that the subject is doing this act of kind of zooming attention onto the hand. Rather, you're saying update your reality model so that the breath is the kind of dominant feature of your reality model.
Right. And I think we even say, effectively, it's simplify your reality model.
Right,
so
right.
It's just dominated by the breath. 80% of the bandwidth is dominated by the breath, and that automatically downweights all the other stuff, peripheral stuff, the thoughts that are going on. Just it all.
to go quite far out with this, the when you emphasized earlier that you call it a reality model because it's, if you call it kind of a world model or an environment model, you can imagine it's just about, okay, this room and I'm simulating this, but at least to me it feels like it stretches as far as you can think about what you think actually exists in like a reified way. So that like with awakening, you could say like even the universe, even space time is a kind of is occurring in our collective consensus reality model. Now, that could make people anxious because understandably it's ungrounding, but I would say those three dimensions exist somewhere in the numinous unfolding of reality, and we're tuning into them. So there's a relative structure there, but that we shouldn't expect the ground of existence, or when we start to look at the subatomic level, we shouldn't be surprised that you don't find those three dimensions of space very neatly as a stage on which everything's playing out. The idea that everything's playing out in a stage of three-dimensional space plus time is occurring in our shared reality model.
Yeah, exactly. It's worth just talking about this because, of course, as you say, we kind of slightly provocatively call it a reality model. And that's really to emphasize the fact that actually we're always living within our phenomenal world. That is our reality. Now, there is then the further metaphysical issue to say, well, what is ultimate reality? What is the nature of, but actually, even describing it, even thinking about it, it's all just models. We never get beyond the models at all. And to the extent that we do, it will be ineffable and incommunicable in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it maybe a bit like if you were looking at say you were in a water park and there were like loads of fountains everywhere, and you're looking at the reflections of the fountains in a mirror, and there seems to be some kind of emergent structure where actually they seem quite solid. And the mirror here is your kind of conscious experience. You're not directly in touch with the water of the fountains, but then actually say, it's a bit of a weird analogy, but say that the mirror is actually made of water too. It's a reflection in a pond, right? That's actually a better way to say it. Say it's a reflection in a pond. And then suddenly, I guess the getting closer to fundamental reality is a sense of dropping the contracted thinking that the structures you thought were there were really there, and seeing actually everything's just water. Even my awareness is made of water. And in this analogy, you can't really say what water is, but it's like, I think the ripples that arise in our awareness, we can get the feeling we're getting closer and closer to them reflecting the structure of fundamental reality, say like impermanence and flux. And, I think the deeper you settle into impermanence, it would make sense if the ground of being had some impermanent kind of flux to it rather than being solid stuff, because you see that solid stuff is like an emergent conceptual overlay. We're gonna be straying from your paper here and getting into the deep end of the
obviously as you say, like we can go into these deep aspects, but we haven't obviously done that in the paper. We've in a sense we've been silent about the metaphysical stances that one can take, and I see this importantly as a plural. In other words, this theory of consciousness is compatible with different metaphysical views, and now I'm kind of revealing my own perspective, which is I'm totally happy to talk about different metaphysical views, and that they're also just stories.
Yeah, I think so. I guess to me, I would say the most important idea I've come across when it comes to understanding reality and our place with it is this idea of inference. Kind of, you could say inference to the best explanation, where you make some guess about what's going on in the world, and it's particularly this kind of variational inference where you make a guess and then you say, well, if my guess is correct, what do I expect to see? And then if you see that, you go, okay, that confirms, I'll never be able to directly confirm that my guess is absolutely 100% true, but an emergent harmony can arise where you're like, yep, that's what I thought was going to happen. Yep, looks like I'm on the right track here. And to me, that's the the egoic mind has this craving, like this existential anxiety, where it really wants to pin stuff down with absolute 100% precision. It's almost as if it wants to just be done with reality and just be like, let's get it all done, and then we can just move on. Whereas our the kind of boundlessness of being is such that we're always, it's always this unfolding. So, but when you have this idea of inference is the best explanation, I mean, I think it can even get you out of solipsism in the sense very easily, where you're just like, I'll never know for sure that I'm not the only mind in existence. I could wake up in the next moment. I could be in the matrix. But if I exist and Shamil's another human being, and then I expect in a second he's going to say some words to me, and then and it's this constant feeling like you're in touch with reality because it's constantly being confirmed. And I think, I mean, and then it turns, the story we're telling, that's the kind of core of the free energy principles. It seems to account for dynamics of cognition and the mind, and we think consciousness. It's also formally the same as Darwinian evolution in terms of its structure, as like organisms are like these hypotheses, kind of the guesses that are being tuned to their niche. I think even the mystery of fine tuning of like why our universe is suitable for life. Some people you speculate about multiverse, and a lot of people get kind of hung up on whether that's justifiable. But again, I would say if your guess is we're the only universe in existence, then you have this gigantic error signal in terms of why is it fine-tuned for life. And then if you guess that there's a lot of universes, then you have no error signal because eventually it's going to pop up in one of them. So again, you get this kind of this evolving harmony, but you need to be comfortable. You need to be comfortable without that catharsis of the rational mind wanting to kind of pin everything down. So it's that kind of unknowing, that relaxing back into the mystery but it's like you once you're content to not know, suddenly it's like, oh, I'm actually in touch with, like, I'm content that I'm not directly in touch with reality. And then it's like, actually I'm really coupled to it. Maybe coupled on, I'm resonating with it. I am in touch with it actually. Like, it's mediated, but like there's
James, this is great because I'm really resonating with you actually right
exactly.
now. I actually really think this is right. And let me just emphasize the point that you made, which is, a general trait that we would have as an egoic mind, but especially from the age of the Enlightenment, from the scientific revolution, which is, I want to know the truth of the matter, how it really is. We need to, that's what I need to know. I want to know whether, like, I'm looking at this as in your analogy on this reflection on the water surface, and I'm kind of seeing fountains and all this kind of stuff, but I want to know whether it really is fountains. Now, this may not be where you want to go, so just let me pull me back here, but we really need to talk about truth there, and why that itself is problematic, and why this view of things actually gives a better account, and actually has, as philosophical views of truth have evolved, they've come to more and more cohere with this approach that we're talking about, inference to the best explanation. So the original, should I go into this?
Definitely. No, I want to jump in there because the reason I started talking about that is because you mentioned stories, and I wanted to basically validate what you were saying in terms of this can fit with different metaphysical frameworks, because we're offering stories. We're telling, and given that we think that consciousness is this kind of inference process, it's like the knowingness. So you can tell stories about why the knowingness of consciousness exists, but those will be stories that arise within the knowingness. So the knowingness is primary in that sense. But then actually you look at the story and you go, well, that's a really good story that explains why it would be a kind of knowing thing. But then you kind of, so I think people want to kind of, the current scientific mainstream really reifies, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where they reify the stories. They think the story is the world. And then you have the philosophers like Evan Thompson's new book, The Blind Spot, that came out, which goes the other way and goes, actually, we shouldn't be grounding out there in what we think is the objective world, because actually that's just our models of it. We should be grounding in here in our experience of the world. What I'm saying is, let go of the need to lean on either side and be groundless. Let the knowingness be primary, and then let the story be a completely satisfying, great story about why the knowingness exists, but then notice that it never encapsulates the knowingness, and just like it's it's a groundlessness that's also a grounding everywhere. You can just flow in into both.
Yeah, this is actually deep stuff, and this might be slightly unsettling to a lot of listeners, but I can tell you this is it. What you said is it. But like let's try to at least give some. I mean, you just went right to the end, right?
But I mean, just as to point to the anxiety people might raise for people, I guess, yeah, I guess this is like groundlessness being this is what I was saying about the egoic mind doesn't like this groundlessness, this flow, the constant movement of existence, and so it gets that existential anxiety, and yeah, I guess on a more pragmatic individual well-being level, I guess the pointing here is to say, become familiar, move towards that, learn that you can swim in those waters. You can be okay with groundlessness. Is not only okay, everything is always that way, and you can align with it, and it's liberating and it's beautiful and wonderful. It can be hard, there can be challenges when you're unblocking your resistance to the groundlessness, but yeah, this is. I guess I don't know anything deeper than groundlessness. Maybe I've just given my.
I actually really agree with you. I think that's really it. But let me give at least some philosophical rungs of the ladder to help here.
Yeah.
Because so we talked about truth here. So the traditional conception of truth, and I would say the common sense view, is that some proposition P is true if and only if there exists, it is the case that P out there in the world. So in other words, this proposition is true if it in fact is the case that there corresponds something in the world that is P. Okay, now that's called a correspondence theory of truth. Now the problem with that is that as we've discussed, in this predictive processing framework and in the Kantian view as a whole, how do we ever know what reality is in itself? We actually have no access to the world the noumenal world, as Kant would call it, the world as it is in itself. We only have our perceptions, our inference about the world, and that's called the phenomenal world. And so there's a real problem. And so over time, the correspondence theory, I mean, philosophers recognize that there's this common sense view that what truth really means is something is true if it is the case that this corresponds to something out there in the world that is P. This is deeply problematic because it sort of has access to reality. And how do we have that? So then the reaction was something else, which was a coherence theory of truth, where beliefs are true beliefs if they cohere with all the other beliefs. In other words, if we have beliefs that sort of reinforce each other, then they're true. But now this, and that's beautiful, and in a way, there is some very powerful insight, which of course resonates, but it's got the opposite problem in a sense. It's freely floating independently of the world. The world can simply glide past this coherent. I could have a whole series of beliefs that I believe, but they're just somehow not connected to reality or to the sensory data, for example. And so that's the coherence theory. And then finally, probably around the late 19th century, early 20th century, we started getting a pragmatic theory of truth with Charles Sanders Peirce and William James and many others. And this was very beautiful. This was sort of almost acknowledging that truth is a kind of noble fiction. It is in a sense a vanishing point of the end point of human inquiry. So it's like an aspirational goal that we should say, look, let's have an inquiry. I'll say some proposition and you'll say, well, I have some sensory data and I see it like this, and you'll see it like this, and then we'll go out and we'll collect some water from the well, and we'll actually see if it's hot or cold, and or find out where the well is or whatever, and interact with the world, and we'll still all be within our phenomenal worlds. We'll be communicating in this intersubjective reality, but this intersubjective reality will not be freely floating by itself. It will, in a sense, be grounded in resonating with reality, in the sense that it's resonant with all the sensory data. There's empirical value. So we will have, in this kind of approach, beliefs are good beliefs, or rather, if I can put it provocatively, stories are good stories if they cohere with a lot of other good stories. Beliefs or stories are good beliefs if they have empirical value, in the sense that they can predict my sensory data, and this is the grip. Beliefs or stories are good stories if they are economical and parsimonious. In other words, Occam's razor. Beliefs or stories are good beliefs if they have pragmatic value. In other words, they allow me to survive, or buying the food, or things like that. So we're now in this, in a sense, untethered. In this kind of groundless state, where we've kind of acknowledged that actually this is a shared intersubjective belief structure that but to some extent, of course, it's really all going on in the universe, and it's all coupled and resonant with the universe, and beliefs that are not able to predict my sensory data will not be good beliefs. And so, in the sense, there is this kind of coupling into the world.
Yeah, and I think that's the two truths, of Mahayana Buddhism, where you first you think that the world just is objectively the way it appears, then you realize it's an appearance, and then you realize, well, in a relative way, as an appearance, it has the right structures for, we're in touch with something, like structurally. It's a bit like, I feel like it's like the veil of perception. If it's like a sheet that you're holding up, so that's like your generative guess of what's going on in the world, your hallucination part. Then it's like you hold that sheet up to the object you're interested in, and it conforms closer and closer until it's like completely in every nook and crevice of the object. And that's like the updating your model in line with sensory evidence. And then the situation you're in is you've actually got a really good model there of the structure that you're interested in. It conforms almost perfectly. So you're really in touch with the structure, but you're fundamentally also disconnected. It's fundamentally mediated. And so I think it's like, perception is inherently direct and indirect. You really are resonating with the structure of the wider world, but not directly. And the story we've been telling, I think the reason why the free energy principle as a kind of theory of organisms is a great linchpin for this, is like, just to kind of, I mean, a great thing about this stuff is, I was going to go over it again, like it is, you kind of keep coming at it from the same, it's very loopy, it keeps kind of coming back to it through different channels. But so if you imagine you've got like, you start with this basic imperative I mentioned before of like, if you want to keep being as a thing, don't be surprised. If you're constantly surprised, you're not going to survive very long. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, you need to be informed about what's going on in the world. You need to have this resonance with what's going on in the world if you're going to avoid, being destroyed. And then you need to leverage that in every moment to anticipate what's going to happen to you, right? What sensory evidence you're going to get. And so it's that coupling to the wider world that's I think, it's exciting that people are fleshing this out into a whole kind of Bayesian mechanics of things. And I think that's, like a physics of sentience. I think that's where we're going to, what's also cool about it is it's a kind of scale-free vision of physics. So I think it can take us away from reductionism, where it doesn't need to be, we keep talking about the cosmos evolving along these principles as well as at the smaller scale. But then if you accept that that's a good model of what's going on in us, these kind of guesses and inferences about what's going on in the wider world, that's coupled, then it explains why we are conscious beings that engage in philosophy and talk about ontology and epistemology and how they relate. And like all of this stuff, suddenly kind of the harmony arises and everything's like, yes, it looks like we're on the right track. And again, part of the reason we'll never know is it's inherently a kind of unbounded exploration where each new way of being. Each new belief state kind of creates new niches for you to expand into. So, there's like, I know we both enjoyed Bobby Azarian's book, The Romance of Reality, that really focuses on this aspect, the kind of the unbounded kind of eternal process of ever accumulating knowledge in the forms of kind of structures in the universe through these kinds of dynamics. There are a few points I really want to get to on your paper, and we're really getting into the kind of
let's we've strayed from consciousness to metaphysics a little bit.
But yeah, I always love chatting with you about this stuff, so I'm glad we did. But so another great aspect to this is you mentioned the intuition pumps. So we have this idea, you've got your reality model and it's feeding back into itself, so it knows that it knows, and there's this luminosity of awareness that can increase with meditation and with psychedelics. And you point to this kind of neatly explaining why people talk about expanded consciousness and higher consciousness and becoming more aware. But you use this analogy that it's not that there's a particular mechanism or a particular layer that does this, it's the whole thing timelessly, continually feeding back into itself. Like you use the torus, is that the name of that shape, a kind of donut shape of like a field that's constantly flowing into itself. So it captures this timelessness of knowing, of non-dual awareness, right? That it's not playing out in some kind of linear time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very important to kind of emphasize that this kind of framework allows us to make sense of these deep experiences in meditation and psychedelics. So, what we then apply this framework to meditation, and ultimately we see that you go through these focused awareness stages and open awareness, but eventually one can get to a state where the reflexivity precision of the reality model back onto the reality model is very high, so that there is a clear awareness of awareness. And once at that stage, there can be content in the reality model, or in some cases, the content can be very, very simplified and minimal. And at some stage, when the reality model is very minimal, then really there is just the reality model feeding back onto itself in high epistemic depth. That means that there is simply the awareness of awareness, or awareness of pure awareness, and that is sometimes called the minimal phenomenal experience, a term used by Thomas Metzinger. And traditions in Buddhism have called it clear light cessation, or just the experience of clear light, or in Hinduism it might be something like, in Advaita Vedanta, something like a nirvikalpa samadhi, pure samadhi, where there is no contents but just bright luminous awareness. And then of course in psychedelics, we've been trying to think about computational models of how psychedelics work, and one of the things that is a very powerful model that I'm very keen on and helped to develop was this Rebus framework, where essentially we have a reduction in top level, the weighting of top level priors. But there is something else that's going on in psychedelics, which is that sometimes the epistemic depth, this weighting of the reality model back to itself, can be increased very dramatically, and there is a sort of there can be a recognition in psychedelics states of this, and in a sense, this phenomenology that people have in an expanded state of consciousness is really referring to the fact that most people wouldn't have dialed up the sort of awareness of awareness part of their reality model, that that much. It hasn't, they don't normally in normal life live in such states of high epistemic depth. One thing is important to say, that we're not positing here some sort of other substance of a meta-awareness, as if there's sort of an infinite regress of like, there's awareness and then there's meta-awareness and then there's meta-awareness. And no, in fact, this problem of infinite regress is solved because there is only awareness in the end. This is something that both Ruben and I felt. We've, in the academic world, we've all been slightly led astray with talk of meta-awareness and meta-awareness and things like that.
Right. Yeah, and it's important, I guess, to say that this, even though it's reflexive onto itself, the reality model, it's not self-awareness, right? It's different to that.
Right. So this is very important. So this goes back to, well, we haven't yet, talked too much about the self, but within our phenomenal generative unified world model, our reality model, there is this room, there is all this going on, but there is also a mental construction of a self, including an avatar, including my thoughts. These are my thoughts, and this is my body sensations, and I am moving my arms. I'm an agent, I'm an actor, a doer. I am the knower of things. There's an epistemic model. So all of these things are called a phenomenal self model. This is again Thomas Metzinger, the philosopher's term. And the phenomenal self model is just one part of the reality model, but a very important part of it. And in this reality model, there is this very strange thing that happens. It is very helpful to think that, to have this self model, and that everything works off it. So I am seeing this bottle. So there's this subject-object duality that is created within the reality model. This is a construction. And of course, it's an important construction for an evolutionary perspective, because we need this kind of a data structure so that if a tiger comes at me from over there, I can run up the tree over there because I have a model of where I am relative to the tiger. I have polar coordinates and I know the tree is over there. And so I can have efficient action. So this is why we need to have a self model and really care about the self model so that we can survive. So from an evolution perspective, it is a brilliant data structure. But this is all going on within our phenomenal generative unified world model, within the awareness. And what happens is that within this subject-object duality, there is such a strong subject-object dualism that's created that I think that my consciousness is sort of behind my eyes somewhere, or maybe behind my heart, and then I'm looking out at this hand. But of course, all of this is just arising within awareness. So the sort of very common sense view is that, oh well, there is self-awareness, that I'm aware of myself, but that's not the awareness that we're talking about. In a sense, self-awareness arises within awareness as a whole. And this is what one can come to realize in meditation and through other techniques, seeing that ultimately this is all arising within awareness. And right. So there is this important distinction to make between awareness and self-awareness.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like the organismic process is coupled with this capacity to know, this consciousness, this epistemic quality. But then within that world model, yeah, you get this, as you say, like a data structure where it's simplified to this little kind of cartoonish thing where it's like, well, I'm in here inside the head and I'm looking out there, and that's the thing that's constructed. Even though it begins with this reasonable coupling between awareness and being a bodily subject, but even that is like all of that is codependently arising within the whole of reality, as they're not truly separate things that appear the way they appear.
Exactly. And the illusion is so good that it's very difficult to break out of it. And generally meditation teachers will give very interesting pointing out instructions. For example, they will say, well, if you become aware of your internal body sensations right now, and you just tune into them, and you hear the sounds in the room, you see that the body sensations are arising effectively in the same space as the sounds, and that your body sensations aren't even restricted to your body. They're somehow overlaid on top of everything else. And then you start slowly starting to break down this sort of this view, and you start to realize, I'm starting to see the illusion unravel at the edges here.
Yeah. It's interesting the way that attention, I think, plays a big role in that. Where, like, if you start to pay attention to how you perceive distance, at least in my own experience, it really feels like there's this constant shuttling back and forward that creates a sense of distance. Where it's like, okay, I'm referencing the head or the chest or the neck or something, and then moving out, and it just gives this feeling that there's some gap there. When the more you look, the more you're just like, there really isn't. And when it kind of starts to deconstruct, it's like, what did I think that was? That like that thing that was there.
Exactly. And as you say, we can get into these habits. For example, if you ask somebody to pay attention to their big right toe, then what happens is that sometimes people have a mental image of
Right.
sort of going from the head to the toe and like whatever. But actually, that's like an overlay on top of, making the story more and more solid. But when you really tune into it, there's no need to do that. There isn't, and the big right toe is just there in the reality model, just like everything else.
Yeah. If you go from the sensations in the toe to the awareness of the sensations in the toe to the awareness, like maybe you can see that it's all happening in exactly the same place. There's no distance from that awareness to, you don't need to look at your head to know where the sensations in your toe are. But yeah, it's so conditioned that we do that a lot. With the luminosity and the reflexivity, I love there's a section about sleep as well, and lucidity in sleep, which made a lot of sense.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I mean, the thing is that, of course, in dreams normally, there's all this stuff going on, but we normally have quite low epistemic depth in dreams, and so reality is unfolding, but there's not a lot of knowing what I know in the process. But what can happen is that, especially through certain trainings and perhaps practice of meditation in the daytime, is that the habit of epistemic depth can become quite good, and increasing epistemic depth, and then suddenly one can become aware of the fact that one is having a dream within the dream, and that's a lucid dreaming. Now, that's very interesting, because then, of course, you start to get a lot of freedom, and you can start to change the dream, and there are all sorts of things that can happen from there. But that's not even the most interesting thing. In a sense, the most powerful thing is something where we can become lucid within deep dreamless sleep. Now, some listeners might be surprised that this would be even possible, because it is a very rare event. But advanced yogis and Tibetan monks and many other practitioners could start having what's called clear light, deep dreamless sleep, where our explanation of this is really that within our model, the way we would characterize this is that there's an increase in epistemic depth. So the reality model knows itself, but now there's no content. perhaps even less content than a minimal phenomenal experience. It's very, it might be, you know, very similar to kind of a state of minimal phenomenal experience, but even less perhaps. And it's possibly the most minimal experience of pure awareness. And there's some controversy that, you know, could this even be known? But it's reported enough to say, well, that's an interesting phenomena. But in fact, our framework, you know, can accommodate this kind of experience.
Right. And before we run out of time, it'd be good to bring full circle, close the beautiful loop to the other theories of consciousness we spoke about at the beginning.
Yeah. You know, we at the end of the paper we give a summary table of all the connections that we would have with other theories, and there are several, you know, very important connections. Let me see the first one. Well, first of all, the concept of having a reality model. To some extent, global workspace would cohere with this kind of notion, because, you know, what gets the fame in the brain is what, you know, we would be aware of. Even integrated information theory has this sort of consensus that this is what's going on. There's a sort of what's called a maximal phi complex, some part of the brain which has where there's the whole has more integrated information than all the parts. And even higher order thought theory, what gets up to the meta awareness level is what is our reality model. So this is what we would call the epistemic field of what we know. And so there are these connections. And then the next feature where we see again some interesting connections is whether there's a coherent world model and binding. Now, you know, here, especially, I think integrated information theory does a great job here because they specifically talk about what it is to, you know, what allows information to cohere. Sorry, I raised my hand by mistake. And so I think, you know, again, this binding problem, we approach it in a different way from integrated information theory, but I think in principle, any theory of consciousness really needs to grapple this binding problem, how there becomes this whole coherent, self-dependent description of what's going on. The next feature that we look at is inferential competition. And again, in global workspace, there is a strong notion of essentially some sort of competition to make it up to the global workspace. And probably the same thing in integrated information theory. In fact, what is it that allows information to become to be widely shared within this coherent whole? It must cohere with all the rest, and then it gets integrated into this whole. And the recurrent processing theory that I talked about again has this very strong nature of features that cohere with higher order parts of the cortical hierarchy. Sort of features get emphasized which actually cohere with higher context information, for example. And then the next thing we talk about is reflexivity. Reflexivity is actually very central to theories of consciousness in our view. And here we see reflexivity is very strongly emphasized in global workspace theory because after all, it is information is broadcast up to the blackboard, and then what's the point of that? Is that then it can be shared widely throughout the brain, and then the brain, throughout to other modules, and then it gets shared again. This was basically the global workspace architecture, going back to Bernard Barr's original ideas of this. Again, in integrated information theory, in a sense, reflexivity is built right in at the core. It is about self-referential processes that strengthen. So the network becomes aware of what the network knows, and local recurrence, re-entrant theory and recurrence theory. Again, reflexivity is right there at the center. You have these local feedback loops. And then epistemic depth is another, of course, thing that we talk about. And there, I think, higher order theories really emphasize this quite a bit, to say, that there is, when things get projected to higher order areas, it is only then that we know that we know. So I think that that's another part of it. And then finally is this basic idea of fame in the brain, which is widespread sharing of information. And again, I think global workspace theory and integrated information theory, as I said right at the beginning, have emphasized that, and that's something that we emphasize. So these features of our epistemic depth theory, having an epistemic field or reality model, having a coherent world model, which causes binding, conscious binding, having inferential competition, having reflexivity, having epistemic depth, and then having this wide shared information across the brain. These are the features of our model, but it turns out that they are not totally shared by all the models all the time, but by and large, they seem to be the signatures of what is coming out. And so what we end up with is the possibilities of the beginnings of a unification project. And that's one of the things that we offer up, to say, look, if you look at our theory, it really gives you these 6 core features, and we see that these features seem to be also shared by many other theories some of the time. And so maybe we are starting to pick up in what's really important in consciousness.
Yeah, and it's also fits, talking about synthesizing different theories, it totally fits with my perspective as well. It kind of touches on stuff that I don't touch on at all, in terms of like the meta-awareness, but also in my original Living Mirror paper, I spoke about how I think in the predictive processing framework, the binding problem, I think, is solved very neatly. I think I'm probably articulating basically the same view, where I say it in a kind of top-down way, where it's like, if the causality is based in these high-level beliefs, where what the system, in order to keep surviving over time, the system needs to believe that I'm seeing a human out there, and I believe that a human is the kind of thing that speaks and makes sounds, but also has a visual appearance. I think if you start there, you're kind of beginning with the bound, the guess that that's what's going on in the world, and then it kind of forces everything else to into alignment, and you unpack, I think, it's a kind of corresponding picture in more detail. And there's this natural kind of, we've also both written about the kind of re-entrant dynamics of the thalamus, and you write about this in the paper. And I think that that's a signature that corresponds with consciousness. This kind of 40 hertz oscillation right between thalamus and cortex. And I tend to view these things through selection dynamics, and I think the kind of Edelman's neurodarwinism and those kinds of things, I think we can, if you see selection acting at all levels, you can see why the winning hypothesis kind of has to be stabilized, has to be the thing that the system recruits. Like, why would it comes back to, I guess, that we were talking about, like amplification and resonance, those kinds of processes that lead to, it's the same thing, I guess, as competition that you were talking about. I think just within this framework, you start to get this kind of feeling like, yes, like this is making sense now. It's all starting to kind of cohere. Yeah, so I recommend people read the paper. It's a wonderful read. And thanks again, Shamil. It's always great talking.
Yeah, it's been fantastic, and I really appreciate the great work that you're doing. I mean, this is very important to kind of marry the cutting edge of neuroscience with the cutting edge of meditation and spirituality.
Yeah, well, the feeling's mutual.
Great.
All right, until next time.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.